My name is Audrey Davis, and I'm the director of the Alexandria Black History Museum. On behalf of the Office of Historic Alexandria, or OHA, it is my pleasure to welcome you today to our presentation on the Historic Structures Report for 1315 Duke Street, the site known to many of you as Freedom House Museum. The City of Alexandria purchased 1315 Duke Street in March 2020 from the Northern Virginia Urban League after a successful collaboration with the League, which expanded the reach of the museum. Freedom House Museum is now the 8th museum under the Office of Historic Alexandria. This Historic Structures Report was funded through a grant from the National Trust for Historic Preservation's African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund and through a gift from a private donor. A few housekeeping tips before we start. To preserve bandwidth and limit disruptions, you will notice your audio and video are off. However, our Q&A is open and you may enter questions in the Q&A at any time and they will be read at the end of the presentation. This afternoon, it gives me great pleasure to turn our virtual podium over to our speakers from SmithGroup. SmithGroup is one of the world's preeminent integrated design firms and was hired by the City of Alexandria in February of 2021 to analyze the site for a historic structures report. This report expands our understanding of the property and helps OHA further its goal of establishing a museum to the domestic slave trade. It is my great pleasure to introduce Jim Shepard of SmithGroup. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. We are really excited today to share our collective experience and the end product of this HSR. And just as a quick run of show, we are going to go through a set of introductions and then really walk you through the table of contents of the Historic Structures Report and share with you not only our process, but also how we came to our conclusions and what we found in our investigations that led to those conclusions. So prior to getting to that, I just want to make sure we introduce our collective team that helped to produce this report. We at SmithGroup have a deep bench of people in-house who helped to support this, but we also brought some consultants to the table, structural engineers, architectural historians, and conservators. And we have several of them on the call today. Some will be participating in the presentations, and the remaining group will also be part of the Q&A to make sure we can answer any questions you have. So as Audrey mentioned, I'm Jim Shepard. I'm the Director of Historic Preservation for SmithGroup, and I will hand it over to my colleague, Susan.
Yes, hello. My name is Susan Palmer. I'm so glad that you can join us today. I'm a preservation architect and principal with SmithGroup, and I was the project manager for this historic structure report. And I'll pass it along to Allison.
Afternoon, I'm Allison Semrad. I'm a structural engineer at Silman, and we were invited to be the structural consultants for this job. I worked alongside with Nathan Hicks on this project, and I'll pass it off to Daria.
Hi, everybody. My name is Daria Gasparini, and I'm an architectural historian with Robinson and Associates in Washington, D.C.
And I'm going to redirect back to one of my SmithGroup colleagues, Dayton.
Hey, Jim. Hi, everyone. I'm Dayton Schroeder. I'm an architect, principal, and design director with SmithGroup based out of our cultural studio. And I supported Jim and Susan on this project as project architect.
Hi, I'm Mary Jablonski, architectural conservator at Jablonski Building Conservation, and I'll pass it off to my colleague, Helen.
I'm Helen Thomas Haney. I am also an architectural conservator with Jablonski Building Conservation.
Great, thank you, everybody. So I think you got a good flavor of the team that helped produce all of this. I think it's important to make sure we just give you a little bit of background. Audrey started with the root background of how the City of Alexandria came to own the property, but we were brought on board to basically create this historic structures report. And the goal for this historic structures report is to create a roadmap for the future rehabilitation of the building to become a museum dedicated to telling the story of the history of slave trade at this site, and also as a legacy of domestic slavery in the Chesapeake region across the nation. So we were also tasked to prepare a comprehensive historic background and context regarding the property, along with a chronology of its development and use. We were also tasked to fully assess the building and all of its current systems and give recommendations for mitigating deficiencies. And last, we were also to really map out the chronology of the evolution and the development of the property and define periods of significance and settle on a period of significance. So project goals, we were tasked with making sure we researched the physical and investigations to clarify the building history. So the sequence of the building alterations, significance of the site, and similarities to other slave pens in the Chesapeake region. We were also tasked to make sure we researched and provided documentation that confirmed configurations of the building. So that meant preparing drawings that actually represented the existing conditions of the building. We were to digitally scan the building. That's a new technology of laser scanning the building that would result in three-dimensional point clouds that we could translate to two-dimensional drawings. We were to also photograph and document the entire building and its existing conditions. And at the conclusion of the report, make sure we're providing a bibliography that identifies all the sources that conclude as to how we developed the developmental history. And then in addition to that, also we were to provide a conditions assessment of every system in the building and identify those deficiencies and make recommendations for their improvement. So that included assessing the exterior and interior building materials, looking at the exterior and interior features and finishes, assessing the structural systems and specifically the load capacity of the building and evaluating whether it can support a new use as a museum, looking at interior spaces and their conditions, evaluating the mechanical, electrical, plumbing systems, the fire alarm systems and life safety systems. Also doing some materials sampling and lab testing of specific materials targeted to help us to confirm developmental history. We were to visit the accessibility issues of the building and also look at code compliance. We were provided with a range of previous research. I think 3 of the items that were critical to the development of the HSR were the building and property history developed by Benjamin Skolnick. Also, the previous archaeological descriptions provided in the report in 1987, the archaeology of urban captivity, and last National Register of Historic Places nomination from 1976. So these were 3 critical documents. We obviously had a lot of other research that contributed to our historic structures report, but these were really a great foundation to move forward from. So we also, there were certain goals that were spelled out in the scope of services that were specifically coming from the city. Obviously establishing the general building sequence that has to do with the construction, use, demolition, removal, and renovation of the building. Also trying to really identify the surviving fabric of the building and what periods they dated to and what was left and what survived. Identifying as best as possible the original floor plans of the building. Also identifying the use of the basement during the slave pen era, if that is possible. Understanding how the first floor functioned as a showroom during the slave pen era. Determining the building alterations post 1861 to the present. So really understanding the evolution of the building over time. Identifying as best as possible the fabric that survives from the slave pen period. Categorizing remaining elements of the building that provide identification for specific time periods. And exploring the possibility of returning the south facade to the appearance during the period of significance. So as you can see, there a lot of this has to do with really trying to understand the evolution of the building and what's left of the building from various time periods. We had a whole host of tools at our disposal to explore all that, and I think Susan is going to go into an explanation about the processes that we used to get there.
So the next part of this is about our investigative process. So the first step in our process of understanding the historical context and the developmental history of the site was to begin with a comprehensive review of all existing documentation we could put our hands on. Jim highlighted some of those documents just a few minutes ago. And we required an understanding of this work that came before us to identify connections and research gaps. Connecting these dots was the beginning of documenting the story of 1315 Duke Street. This research included historic photos and artistic renderings, such as an abolitionist broadside from 1836, and early property boundary maps and descriptions from 1851 onward. The Office of Historic Alexandria brought to the table a wealth of research and resources to support this effort. From the more recent history, we also obtained building permits from the 1930s, which assisted in dating the wood siding seen at the 3rd floor of the North Block. Studies and reports completed in the last couple of years also highlighted some of the existing systems and infrastructure, such as the fire alarm system upgrades and identification of building fabric, which contains hazardous materials. As Daria from Robbins & Associates will detail shortly, there were also resources available to understand the historic context and slave trade operations, such as A History of the Slave Trade in Washington by Mary Beth Corrigan. The next step in our investigative process was a collaborative and interdisciplinary field survey. As a team including architects, historians, material conservationists, structural, mechanical, and electrical engineers, and life safety experts, we set out to survey every aspect of 1350 Duke Street by poking around in the mezzanine, exploring the basement, peeling back floor finishes, and climbing on the roofs. For those of us afraid of heights, me being one of them, the city graciously made a bucket lift available last April. This visual perspective was very helpful in documenting existing conditions and finding evidence of the original dogtooth cornice intact, but concealed behind roofing and flashing along the north facade of the south block. This was a notable find because this brick cornice detail differs from what is found along the front facade facing Duke Street. Our investigations behind the exhibit in the basement provided us a better understanding of the structural steel installed in the 1980s to support the original floor joists. The original first floor joists remain intact in the basement. However, the bearing ends of these joists are compromised due to significant wood rot and require supplemental supports. Also found in the basement is evidence of the masonry infill, where 2 below-grade entrances were believed to connect directly to the men's and women's yards during the slave pen period. These days, you cannot document a historic structure or site without the use of some modern fancy equipment. And we routinely use our in-house laser scanning equipment to document historic structures across many phases of a project. The collection of this data provides us a highly accurate record of existing conditions, which greatly assists the efforts to construct a BIM model of the structure. An added benefit of this highly precise data set is the ability to study specific issues and identify issues such as deflection and settlement, which may otherwise be unnoticeable or difficult to measure or discern through routine on-site survey. This tool helped us to better understand the degree to which the main stair is deflecting and identify areas of insufficient support. This area will require further structural evaluation, but it was quickly understood that this stair requires additional structural support at the lowest levels. The data obtained by the exterior laser scan was also helpful in understanding the amount of deflection seen in the chimneys along the east facade. Given the site constraints and the narrowness of the east alley, gaining direct access to this facade was challenging. However, we could quickly see that there is some displacement in this brick, and immediate repair and repointing is highly recommended. So after our thorough review of all existing documents and completing the initial non-destructive site survey, it was time to bring out the toolbox and start cutting openings in the walls and prying up floorboards. We carefully reviewed a list of suggested probes with the Office of Historic Alexandria by presenting our proposed locations, describing what we believed each one of these probes would uncover, and explain in detail what the degree of disruption these probes would cause. The goal was to peel back the layers and find out as many answers as we could. We also hoped to find evidence of original historic fabric, maybe some plaster, maybe paint samples, or maybe even some hidden doors and windows. To assist in this process of discovery and research, we engaged Jablonski Building Conservation to provide a historic finish and mortar analysis. They followed closely behind our highly selective demolition crew to explore what we uncovered in these holes underneath the floorboards and in the joints and crevices of historic millwork and trim to gather samples for laboratory analysis and further study. Some of the most exciting finds were an original floor access hatch into the attic, hidden beneath modern carpet and plywood on the 4th floor. Select areas of intact 3-coat plaster applied directly to the masonry walls, which currently is now concealed behind modern drywall finishes. Some conduit buried in this historic plaster, and yes, we did find a concealed door dating from the late 19th or early 20th century. So Jablonski Building Conservation was engaged to analyze a limited number of paint and mortar samples from the exterior and interior of the structure. The purpose of these analyses was to inform the construction history of the building through paint archaeology and mortar analysis. During a day-long site visit in May, architectural conservators Mary Jablonski and Helen Thomas Haney visited the site and removed paint and mortar samples. The number of samples and sample locations were determined by the conservators in consultation with the architects and historian, with a focus on capturing key elements from specific phases of the building construction and evolution. Upon completion of the finish investigation, sampling, testing, and paint stratigraphies for each element were compiled in table form and compared to other elements in each room. This information was cross-referenced with floor plans and the history of the building to understand changes to the structure over time. The results of this analysis will assist in dating various elements and in the development of a chronology for later additions and alterations. Some of the notable discoveries included paint colors and discovering nuances to the changes in the masonry and windows at the south elevation. Jablonski Building Conservation removed paint samples from the brick between the first and second floors of the front facade in hopes of finding any remaining evidence of the Price, Birch & Company painted signage. The earliest finish on the brick from the signage area consists of a brilliant yellow. It is possible that this finish dates to the building's early periods when it was a residence or first became a slave pen. The second finish is a light reddish brown, which also likely dates to when the building was a slave pen. Unfortunately, it could not be determined if any of the paint sign remains, as no early finishes were found that could be darker lettering over a light background. It is possible the remnants of the sign remain, but finding evidence of the sign will require the removal of several paint samples from undisturbed brick in the area of the signage, as well as several samples from other areas of the south facade for comparison. This is recommended as additional investigations to be completed in the future phases of design. Also, due to the comparison of the paint stratigraphies, the window frames on the south facade likely date to the alterations performed around 1870. It is notable that the windows in the photographs from the Civil War era are shorter and wider than what is currently indicated, and that they were changed post-1866. However, the color of the paint coatings on the brick arches above these windows is similar to the color of the decorative wood lunettes. It is probable that these brick arches and wood lunettes on the south facade date from the early 20th century alterations, around 1905, based on tax records. So this tells us an interesting story in that these windows on the front facade were actually modified twice during period 4 of the building's history. I'll elaborate in more detail shortly about the various periods of history of the structure. So as far as the mortar analysis, unfortunately, all of the mortars analyzed were lime or sand-based mortars, which make ascribing a date of installation based solely on material content impossible. Further complicating the results, the restoration design from 1984 called for the brick on all historic facades to be repointed. So it was very difficult to find original mortar on the facade. As I will describe in more detail in the coming slides, we endeavored to build a virtual model of each time period in the history of 1315 Duke Street. As we dug into the details of each historic document and photograph, it quickly became an exercise of counting bricks. In some cases, we were working to both validate that some historic imagery, either artistic or photographic, could be accurately attributed to this site, and also fitting this evidence into the historical timeline that we were outlining. As documented in an appendix to the historic structure report, you will see that we spent a lot of time in the field documenting specific details and overlaying this information onto historic images. Please note in both of these images the use of the different colored notations. The red is specific notations and commentary that we had regarding the historic image that you see. The overlay of blue text and other line work is trying to align existing building fabric and elements onto these historic images. As you will note, in many cases, we were trying to actually locate windows or doors on the facade, or in the upper portions of the left image, where we were trying to correlate evidence in these photographs to the various roof modifications that were made over the men's yard. In some cases, you will see in the left-hand image, we believe there is tangible evidence remaining along the west facade that you can directly tie to this image taken during the Civil War when the men's yard was used as a prison for Union soldiers. In other cases, such as the image on the right, years of speculation that this image of the woman holding the basket was a view of the women's yard is still difficult to prove. Several features in this image conflict with our understanding of the physical evolution of the site, and in areas which might finally give credibility, we have no extant physical fabric to verify these assumptions. One key element we had hoped to locate on site during our probes was the dogtooth cornice seen at the top of the second floor in the background of this image. Unfortunately, any evidence of a former cornice in this architectural style has been lost. Now I'm going to hand it over to Daria to speak to the building history and significance.
Thanks, Susan. I'd like to start just by saying that it's been a real pleasure and privilege to be part of this HSR team, and also to acknowledge the enormous amount of research that was conducted by the Office of Historic Alexandria at the start of the project and compiled into the 2021 building and property history that Jim showed on an earlier slide. This research was incorporated into the HSR and supplemented with additional context to document the building's history and evaluate its significance. So let's jump into the history, starting with background on the interstate slave trade. After 1808, when the transatlantic slave trade became illegal in the United States, a new source of enslaved labor was needed. So states like Virginia and Maryland and North Carolina, which had a surplus of enslaved workers due in part to the collapsed tobacco economy, emerged to fulfill the demand for laborers in the Deep South and on the Southwest frontier. In some cases, planters from places in Georgia and Alabama made a long journey up to the Chesapeake to purchase enslaved people directly from sellers. But what we also begin to see in the early 19th century is the emergence of itinerant traders. And these middlemen bought enslaved people from rural areas in the Upper South and transported them down to markets in cities like Savannah and Charleston, Mobile, or New Orleans, and they often made very large profits doing this. These speculators found slaves in a number of ways. They solicited impoverished farmers directly. They attended estate sales at auction houses, and traders also bought enslaved people who were caught and jailed while trying to find their freedom. During the early years of the interstate trade, farmers, these itinerant traders were typically small-scale operators. They worked typically alone, and frequently they were found in taverns or hotels. And most transported bondspeople either overland or by river, and using points of embarkment along the Ohio River or along the Mississippi. And overland journeys from the Chesapeake to Mississippi typically took 7 to 8 weeks. Starting in the 1820s, however, we begin to see a vast transformation in the scale, geography, effectiveness, and profitability of the domestic slave trade. We see slave traders forming partnerships with one partner who was assigned to handle purchases, often accomplished using a network of agents that were assigned specific geographical regions. And those same partners would then transport people from point A to point B. And then another partner would be located in the Deep South and would be focused on handling sales transactions. The use of maritime transport also became more widespread during this time, increasing the frequency with which traders could ship bondspeople. Larger seafaring vessels could carry more than 200 enslaved workers per trip. And rather than relying on word of mouth, traders started using newspapers to promote their businesses and advertisements. I should mention that Franklin and Armfield owned and operated a fleet of ships and introduced packet lines, which offered fixed routes and regular schedules to traders. So instead of working from taverns or hotels, firms like Franklin and Armfield also began to establish permanent places of operation. In the Upper South, cities like Baltimore, Washington, D.C., which included Alexandria up until 1846. Richmond and Norfolk became thriving slave collecting and resale centers. Scholars who have studied slavery's impacts estimate that between 1820 and 1860, forced migration affected over 880,000 enslaved lives, with 60 to 70% of this migration attributed to the domestic slave trade. So now I've hopefully briefly provided some context within which the slave pen at 1315 Duke Street was established. So let's look more closely at the characteristics of a typical urban slave pen in the Chesapeake. For the purposes of this study, the term slave pen was used to describe a permanent facility run by a slave trader or firm, and usually consisting of several buildings and structures, including a jail. We see examples of the term slave pen used in this way in literature of the antebellum era, but other terms used to describe these facilities included slave jail or slave depot. Contemporary descriptions of slave pens were published in newspapers and travelogues or in the literature of abolitionists. And these descriptions provide us with wonderful evidence of what these places look like and how they operated. First, you have to ask the question, where were they found? Slave jails were typically located a short distance from a wharf if they were located in a port city like Baltimore, or they might be at the outskirts of town along a trade route or a turnpike, or in areas of a city with low property values that were out of the public eye. Slave pens established later in the 1850s might be located near railroad stations. Perhaps the most obvious physical manifestation of a slave pen was its fence or wall. While the primary function was meant to prevent escape, these types of enclosures also blocked communication with outsiders and concealed the slave pen's inner workings. Depending on the scale of the enterprise, a slave pen might include a combined residence and office. One visitor to the Franklin and Armfield slave pen described the office there as a well-furnished room where he was offered wine from a sideboard. Rooms on the upper floors of the residence / office may have been reserved for the slave trader's family, for agents who worked for the firm, or for travelers. Spaces in the attic or basement may have been used by the enslaved people who ran the households or as areas of confinement. Yards were another typical feature. They provided an open or partially open space capable of holding large groups of enslaved people. For many traders, in addition to providing a space of captivity, a slave yard would function also as a sales room where buyers could come and inspect a trader's inventory. Another typical feature was a jail, and this was a separate building where enslaved people could be securely locked up for days or perhaps even longer periods awaiting transport. Contemporary descriptions indicate that the interiors of slave jails were typically divided into separate rooms, often called pens or apartments, that were used for holding more than one person rather than functioning as a space for solitary confinement. Having separate cells rather than one large space protected against internal threats such as the spread of disease or insurrection. Some slave traders also built boarding houses within their slave pen complexes. These were used to accommodate visitors. Other specialized buildings that you might find included a kitchen, a laundry, a tailor shop, perhaps, an infirmary, and then stables and other support buildings for organizing coffles and shipments. So now we turn and ask, where does 1315 Duke fit into this framework? So to go back to the history of the slave pen, 1315 Duke starts in 1828. And that was when Franklin and Armfield, this was a newly established business partnership formed by Isaac Franklin and John Armfield. They began leasing the property, which had been built 15 years earlier as a private residence. Armfield was the partner who presided over the Alexandria slave pen. He supervised purchasing agents and organized the slaves' transport, both overland by coffle and via the coastal route. Franklin, on the other hand, managed the sales from depots in New Orleans, Natchez, and beginning in 1833, forks in the road outside of Natchez. Both of these men were involved in the slave trade in Alexandria prior to forming their business alliance. The firm speculated on a massive scale and was responsible for the forced migrations of thousands of enslaved men, women, and children from Virginia and Maryland to the Deep South. In the process, Franklin and Armfield became the largest slave trading firm on the continent, and its headquarters were at 1315 Duke Street. So I would be remiss not to mention Joshua Rothman's recent history of Franklin and Armfield, which undoubtedly will provide greater understanding of the history of our property. So at the time of Franklin and Armfield's acquisition, the property encompassed 1 acre bound by Duke Street on the south, Payne on the east, and West Street on the west. The traders made substantial changes to the site, constructing walls to enclose yards, separating the men and the women, and adding buildings. Susan will cover in greater detail the construction chronology as we understand it of the site. The slave pen in Alexandria was notorious during its time. It was described and denounced by politicians, journalists, and abolitionists, some with international audiences. And these descriptions have been an invaluable source for understanding the appearance and function of the slave pen over the years. However, the only known image of the Franklin and Armfield slave pen during their period of ownership is from a broadside published by the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1836 that Susan mentioned earlier. You see in this image the headquarters building, originally built as a residence and then later used as a residence and office. And you see a line of enslaved people exiting to join a coffle. And there's a closed board fence around the lot. And to the right of the house, if you're standing looking at it from the front, is what we believe to be the women's yard. And behind that space was a 2-story building set back from Payne Street. And despite our best efforts, there's still no definitive answer as to how that building functioned. The men's yard, which is not quite visible in that image, would have been to the left of the three-story townhouse. Franklin and Armfield left the property in 1837, but the site continued to be used by merchants engaging in the trafficking of enslaved people for another 24 years. The morning after Virginia ratified the Ordinance of Secession on May 23, 1861, thousands of federal troops seized Alexandria. And this was the beginning of what would become a 5-year military occupation of the city. U.S. Army troops quickly liberated the slave pen at 1315 Duke Street and requisitioned it as an Army quarters and military prison. At the beginning of the war, neither the U.S. Army nor the Confederates really had a system in place for the care of their prisoners of war. Instead, military prisoners were paroled and released immediately after capture on their oath that they would never take up arms again. The earliest prisons were really improvised. Men were held in converted warehouses or even in requisitioned college buildings. At the Alexandria prison, soldiers were incarcerated in the men's and women's yards. Officers were quartered in the townhouse and guards were housed in the back buildings. In February 1862, a soldier being held in the prison died from exposure to the elements. And this prompted Congress to conduct an investigation into the conditions there. And as a result, the Army made substantial changes to the former men's yard. The height of the walls were increased by roughly 4 feet, and the space, which had previously been mostly open, was enclosed with a monitor roof. And you'll recall the well-known photograph of the prison interior that Susan actually had up on an earlier slide, showing a row of cells for solitary confinement that were built in the men's yard during the Civil War period. After the war, in May 1866, the Army returned the former slave pen and prison to its owner, and who then sold the property, which had become very run down, to a developer named Thomas Swan. And Swan essentially cleared the majority of the sites, with the exception of the early 19th century dwelling house, the kitchen outbuilding behind it, and we believe a portion of the addition linking the two structures. He then subdivided the eastern portion of the parcel into 6 narrow lots, where he built a series of brick row houses, now today 1301 to 1311 Duke Street, and these were completed in 1870. And Swan also renovated the dwelling house to convert it into a boarding house. The building functioned in this capacity through the early 20th century. But between 1902 and 1907, a half story was added to the house under a mansard roof. And that's the configuration we still see today. And a third story was added to the rear wing. The property changed hands a few more times during the 20th century before being converted into an office building in the mid-1980s. It was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1978. And the building was dedicated as the Freedom House in 1988 in honor of Lewis Henry Bailey, a formerly enslaved man once held in the slave pen. In 1997, the Northern Virginia Urban League acquired the building and used it as its headquarters. And finally, the City of Alexandria purchased it in 2020, marking the start of its most recent chapter of the building's history. So that was a very brief summary of the functional evolution of 1315 Duke. And Susan will now walk through a series of 3D renderings to explain the construction chronology in greater detail.
Thank you. So the purpose of this chronology, shown in the upcoming slides, is to describe the major periods of development of 1315 Duke Street and to identify its original construction, modifications, and uses based on historic documentation and our physical evidence. The primary source of archival documentation for this section of the HSR is the Building and Property History Report prepared by the Office of Historic Alexandria and completed in January 2021. The development of the property can be divided into 5 periods. Each of these periods is described sequentially in the HSR. There are some sub-periods to some of these distinct 5 periods of the history, but I will primarily focus on the high level of the five different distinct periods of history. The information is presented first in a narrative form that describes alterations to the physical fabric and changes in use. These narratives are followed by scaled floor plans and 3-dimensional sketches that illustrate how the layout and massing of the structure change over time. So before I begin discussing period 1, I just will ask that you note how the use of color indicates known changes during a period in history. Those being shown in teal, those changes that we know occurred. Other areas of conjecture of probable modifications shown in the dark red color. And as we progress through the various phases, features remaining from the prior period are indicated in gray. We also developed nomenclature to refer to each section of the structure. As you've probably heard us mention, there's a south block, which is the primary residence along Duke Street, a central passage connecting the south block to the north block, and the north block being the original outbuilding at the north end of the property, and also a 1985 addition. So period 1 covers the initial development of the property by Brigadier General Robert Young and its ownership by the Mechanics Bank of Alexandria. Daria just outlined that this encompassed a 1-acre parcel comprising 2 half-acre town lots along Duke Street. The period encompasses the years in which the brick dwelling house would eventually become 1315 Duke Street, was originally built and used both as a leased and as an owner-occupied residence. Also during this period, a detached 2-story brick outbuilding was constructed behind the dwelling house. In many ways believed to be the original kitchen, this north block. Notable features during this period include hand-molded brick primary facade laid in Flemish bond, molded brick cornice, which remains intact today along the south facade, 12/12 light double hung wood windows with flapjack arches, and a side gabled wood shingled roof, twin corbelled chimneys along the west elevation, and as I mentioned before, the 2-story outbuilding with the possible central passage connection indicated here as conjecture. Period 2, known as the slave pen period, began in 1828 and lasted until 1861, covers the time period during which 1315 Duke Street was used as a center for the interstate slave trade. During this time, several iterations of slave trader partnerships utilized the property and made changes to the building and the site to accommodate this commercial function. This period has been identified as the period of significance for the property. Daria will elaborate on that more in a few minutes. Notable features during this period include substantial investment and development of this 1 acre site, the enclosure of a men's yard to the west and a women's yard to the east. There's significant security features, which Daria mentioned, including high brick walls, perimeter stockade fencing, and iron grated security doors. Partial enclosure of the central passage between the north and south blocks of the structure. There's construction of a 2-story outbuilding along Payne Street. And written historical counts and artistic renderings also highlight various modifications to the roof or shed covering over the men's yard. Period 3 is the military occupation during the Civil War, spanning from 1861 to 1866. At the start of the Civil War, the U.S. Army troops entered Alexandria and liberated the former Franklin and Armfield slave pen, then operating under the management of Price, Birch and Company. The Army then requisitioned the property and converted it into a military prison. The former slave yards were used to incarcerate prisoners. The dwelling house was transferred into officers' quarters, and the guards were housed in the outbuildings. Notable features during this time period include construction of the prison cells within the men's yard that Daria mentioned in her prior description and was also noted in the earlier photograph. Complete roof enclosures over the men's yard with a continuous monitor. Additional changes a few years later increased the height and pitch of this roof and provided 2 lanterns. And later years of military occupation saw the installation of 3 windows with security bars along the south facade of the men's yard. Period 4 is when the house was used as a boarding house and an apartment building from 1866 to 1984. Period 4 encompasses the post-Civil War period through the mid-1980s, when many of the spaces and structures associated with the slave yard and the U.S. Army prison were razed. The early 19th century dwelling house was converted first into a boarding house and then to flats and finally into an apartment building. The property was transformed into a typical urban block composed of residential and commercial buildings, representing multiple periods in the developmental history of Alexandria. The former slave pen at 1315 Duke Street was designated a National Historic Landmark during this period. Notable features during this period include a circa 1870 reframing of the windows along the south facade to modify the width and sill and header heights, including the installation of 2/2 double hung wood windows. I highlighted that earlier in my description regarding the paint and finish analysis, indicating that some of those findings tell us that the modifications to the windows along that south facade actually occurred during 2 different time periods. The removal of the central entrance door, which was considered the primary entrance for the slave trading operation, and converting that back to a double hung wood window. The installation of double hung wood windows on the east and west gable end walls that you now see in the alleys, both to the east and west of the property. And the reconstruction of the central passage 2-story addition. As Daria just mentioned, the 6 adjacent row houses were constructed east of the south block in location of the former women's yard, circa 1870, and those are still there today. I included an additional slide here depicting the additional periods 4B and 4C, strictly for this period because I think it highlights some of the substantial changes that were made in the middle of period 4. Which those included the reframing of the windows along the south facade to modify the style from the federal to more Italianate, the segmental brick arch and the carved wood lunettes that I described earlier. The modification of the entry door at the west end of the south facade to provide a wider double wood panel door with a transom under a segmental brick arch. This was a subtle change, but something that we did discover in our research. And as Daria mentioned, the reframing of the roof structure to provide a mansard roof and provide more accommodations at the 4th floor or mezzanine level. This included installation of dormer windows at the south and north facades of this south block of the building or the original residence of the building. There were also modifications made to the east and west gable end walls to support the roof framing of this new mansard roof. And in addition, which one of the reasons why I included this additional image is this highlights the wood frame 3rd floor addition with the double hung wood windows above the central passage and north block of the building. And period 5 is when this building was used as an office building and museum from 1984 until 2020. So the Washington, D.C. residents and investors, J. Peter Dunstan and Betty Dunstan, acquired the property in 1984 and renovated and expanded the historic structure to convert it into an office building. Prior to the renovation, luckily, archaeological investigations were carried out at 1315 Duke Street and at the adjacent property to the west, which was 1317 through 1321 Duke Street. The building was dedicated as Freedom House in 1988 in honor of Lewis Henry Bailey, a formerly enslaved man once confined in a slave pen. And this time, the Northern Virginia Urban League purchased the property in 1997 to use as its headquarters and later used the basement as an exhibit space. The interpretive and educational use of 1315 Duke Street is continued under the current ownership of the City of Alexandria. Notable features during the period under the Dunstan ownership include the significant and substantial, what we refer to as the 1985 addition at the northeast portion of the property. This was constructed following the archaeological investigations in this area. Some recent modifications undertaken by the City of Alexandria as the newest stewards of the historic site include upgrades for first floor restrooms to provide accessible accommodations, replacement of all mechanical systems, and also the completion of elevator repairs and upgrades, the installation of a new kitchen for staff use, and various finished repairs and repainting in preparation of the reopening and installation of new exhibits. Now I will allow Daria to jump back in and speak to the period of significance.
The HSR defines the period of significance of 1315 Duke Street as 1828 to 1861. This interval includes the years that Franklin and Armfield both leased and owned the property. It encompasses its use by other merchants participating in the trafficking of enslaved people, and reflects the building's decades-long affiliation with the domestic slave trade in Virginia. These years also correspond to the period of significance identified in the National Historic Landmark nomination. And so what does this mean really? The period of significance is one factor used in determining an overall treatment approach for the building, and it provides a baseline for identifying what building fabric contributes to the significance and what does not. And so that was very brief, but I think it's a good lead into Susan's discussion of the building inventory.
I do want to mention, it's notable that the City of Alexandria did commission to have a scaled model of the site built to the period of significance, which you see the images on the right here. These were completed by Bernard Kempinski, and I believe he may be in the audience today listening, so just go. So for part 7, I want to discuss the physical description and inventory. Our comprehensive team of architects and engineers carefully documented the existing structure to provide a thorough physical description and inventory of all existing building fabric, and a set of architectural plans, elevations, and sections were developed in Revit. The data collected through on-site hand measurements and the use of the laser scan were referenced to produce the set of documents which will be a critical tool in the next phases of design to rehabilitate the structure. In addition to these drawings, each space inside the building was carefully inventoried to provide photographic documentation and a matrix identifying all building features and elements. Features were identified as contributing or non-contributing to the period of significance, and this inventory will serve as a guide for what can be removed and what must be maintained related to the period of significance. As you see in the 2 example images, each space was cataloged with photographs and a corresponding matrix to identify flooring, walls, ceilings, and any other intact architectural feature to provide a description, attributed date of its construction, which historical period this relates to, and also provide the justification and our documentation for how we determined the age of that element. And as I mentioned before, identifying which of those elements are considered contributing to the period of significance and which are non-contributing. Part 8 discusses the conditions assessment. Simultaneous to developing a physical description of all spaces and features, each element was evaluated for its condition to identify deficiencies and deterioration. Our review outlined code and life safety compliance and evaluated site and building accessibility. We conducted a detailed interior and exterior survey to identify deferred maintenance. The structural engineers inspected existing framing to understand structural capacity and identify areas of deterioration and structural deficiencies. As you can see in these two elevations, we are mapping out damage and to the existing masonry facade and areas where repairs are necessary. Based upon this conditions assessment, we developed a series of work recommendations to address these issues of deferred maintenance and code or accessibility compliance. The findings of our survey and assessment are documented in work recommendation narratives, plans, and elevations, which are currently being used to estimate the cost of future work. I will highlight here that we reviewed accessibility and provided recommendations to include site accommodations and increased access throughout the interior of the structure. The exterior was evaluated and exterior repairs to focus on masonry restoration and wood window, wood siding repair, restoration, and select replacement. Interior repairs are focused on limited areas of water infiltration, floor deflections at the central staircase, and finish and lighting upgrades. Structural recommendations seek to address localized masonry cracking and displacement, localized repairs at the central stair, and further seismic evaluations if select interior partitions are removed. Live load capacity diagrams, as you see in this image, are provided to assist the city in understanding potential uses and occupancies within the constraints of a historic wood frame and masonry structure. Future work recommendations to address existing mechanical systems were limited since these systems were recently replaced. Plumbing fixtures require upgrading to meet code and accessibility standards. In addition, the electrical service and metering could be streamlined and consolidated. As you notice, I call it the wall of electricity in the basement. In the next stages of programming, a more substantial building code evaluation is required to verify life safety and egress, and a few fire alarm and fire suppression system deficiencies were identified. I will now hand it over to Jim Shepard to address treatment and use.
Thank you, Susan. After obviously doing a tremendous amount of investigative research, understanding the history of the building and trying to get a good idea of the work recommendations, we did provide several treatment and use options to discuss with the city. And I will walk you through each one of those, and they obviously have different components and different approaches as to how we would treat the property. Susan, could you advance to the next slide? Thank you. So treatment one is basically restoring the building to the period of significance. Now, we had to put that out there as an option. Obviously, doing that would require significant removal of existing additions over time so that the building could, as best as possible, resemble the period of significance of period two. Now, obviously, the challenge with this is not only are you removing existing and newer additions to the building, you're also missing the surrounding landscape that would actually be true to that period, returning to that period of significance, because the properties have been sold off and other properties have been built in. But we did discuss that and put that out on the table. Treatment two was restoring the south facade to the period of significance and removing the mansard roof that was added at a later date so that the front facade resembles as much as possible the period two period of significance. And it would also, it would require limited alteration to the remainder of the building and basically a full restoration of that front facade. It would mean that you're going to lose the fourth floor and the office space that is incorporated into that to be able to accommodate that removal of that mansard roof and some modifications on the inside to rectify the fact that you've removed the mansard roof. So that's treatment two. Treatment three is similar. But basically you would be restoring the south facade to the period of significance of period two, but retaining the mansard roof at the south block and obviously making the interior modifications accordingly. So similar to treatment two, but you're maintaining that mansard roof. And then treatment four is really a rehabilitation approach, which is basically that the existing historic and non-historic fabric would remain, and it would allow for the greatest flexibility and the use of the interpretation of the site and the building. So those are the four treatment and use options that we discussed. And the treatment recommendation that we put forth and finalized was the treatment option number two, which would include the full restoration of the south facade of the south block to the period of significance of period 2, and the removal of that later mansard roof with dormer windows and additions above that. And obviously included in the restoration of that south facade would be returning the windows to their original appearance, and the doors, door openings, etc., and the formation of that, that roof to the return of its original sloped appearance, while also maintaining the 1980s addition behind and utilizing the inside as a rehabilitated zone to support a museum and administrative space. So further recommendations, obviously you've heard both Daria and Susan in their description of the developmental history of the site and the analysis of the physical fabric in coordination with the understanding of the history, that we did our best as we could with the investigations that we did. But I think obviously when you delve into this history and you don't have as many artifacts and physical fabric to definitively pin down answers, it often opens up more questions. So we did recommend at the conclusion of the HSR that we advance a few additional studies and investigations. So there is some additional paint and finish analysis that is required, targeted paint and finish sampling that might further clarify periods of development of some of the things that we still had questions about. There are additional probes that could be done. We did show you that we had implemented 19 probes, but I think again that opened up some question about additional areas related to existing flooring, the stair 1 construction and supports, potentially clarifying a particular opening infill and confirming the structural framing throughout. We also had suggested some additional archaeological investigation. Now, this is a little bit more challenging, obviously, because things have been covered over, and in order to do the additional investigation for archaeology in the areas we identified of Corridor 105, the restroom 106 and restroom 108, and the area that's currently a kitchen, it will require that you have to pull up the existing concrete slab to complete that. But obviously, we had to put that out there on the table. If that is possible, we certainly would appreciate doing that to be able to further confirm assumptions that we have made that were not necessarily answered in the previous archaeological report. And then also there were other research topics that came up. I think in Daria's research, she certainly did a thorough research about the slave trade in the Chesapeake region and how slave transport took place, but there was some question about how the railroad did play a part in that. And although we mentioned it, there was an interest in having that further researched. And then also 20th century building history, confirming some of that with oral histories and conducting those oral histories. And that was not a part of this HSR, but that would certainly be a benefit for confirming and extending the historic research that supports our findings in this HSR. And then next steps. So I think there is an interest to having the museum open an exhibit in the spring of 2022. And Audrey, do you want to talk a little bit more about this? Or
Sure. Thanks, Jim. Thank you very much. And I want to thank all of the members of SmithGroup for a wonderful presentation, and so much work has been done on the site. And so we're so thankful that you were able to share this with us today. And I know that a lot of you want to know our future plans for Freedom House. But before I go into that, I'd like to remind you that if you have questions for our team, please place them in the Q&A, and we will be happy to answer them. We know it's close to 5, but we're going to go a little bit after 5 just so that we can have a chance to get some questions answered by SmithGroup. Our plans right now, though, are to open the Freedom House Museum in the spring of 2022. And so we look forward to seeing you all again. And when you come back, you will be very excited to see that you will be able to travel through 3 floors of the building. So we're very happy that that will be an opportunity not only for you to see an exhibit to the domestic slave trade on the 1st floor, but traveling exhibits on the 2nd and 3rd floors as well. We are also going to begin the next stage in the process, the master planning. And this is a really exciting part for us. This first part was exciting, but this is even more exciting because we get to hear from you. And this will be the part that includes a lot of community engagement and finding out what you feel the future of Freedom House should be. There are many opportunities. We really have a major site and a landmark to the history of the domestic slave trade and the role of African Americans in this country in the building of our nation. And so we want to have input from you. We will also begin fundraising because restoration and preservation of this building will require a substantial amount of money. And we will also begin the design process and the request for bids for design and build for the restoration and the reopening. As I said in the beginning, we will open in spring of 2022, and those will be with temporary exhibits. We anticipate opening with our formal exhibition in 2026. If you'd like to find out more information about the work from the Historic Structures Report from SmithGroup, you can find that on our website, and also an incredible history of Freedom House by Dr. Ben Skolnick. We are proud to say a member of our Alexandria archaeology team and probably one of the most well-versed people on this site in Alexandria. So very happy to mention that. We do have some questions in the Q&A, so I'll start with the first question, and that is, what happened to the basement? And Jim and the SmithGroup team, would you like to take that?
Sure, I'll let Susan answer that question because I know she's most familiar with its existing conditions and what is down there now.
So yes, if you're asking about the existing conditions of the basement, as I mentioned in the presentation, the Urban League had installed an exhibit down there a number of years ago. I believe that the city will be reinterpreting that and installing a new exhibit in the basement. There were some recent modifications, and I say recent, meaning about in the 1980s. There was some excavation and underpinning to increase the floor-to-floor height in the basement. So when you go down there, there's an existing concrete slab on grade, and you can see evidence of that underpinning of the foundations. The basement primarily consists of two spaces that we believe were used to house slaves. It's notable in the northeast corner and along the west facade of the basement, there is evidence of masonry infill. And we have correlated that with some of the archaeological investigations that were also done in the 1980s. And we believe that those were basement entrances that could likely have been connections directly to the men's yard and to the women's yard. But of course, those have been infilled through the years. And so currently there's the exhibit down there as well as some of the equipment serving the elevator and some mechanical equipment. One of the interesting things that we would like to do is remove the existing drywall ceiling and better evaluate the original floor framing, which is still intact. And as I mentioned, is currently being supported by some supplemental steel framing.
Susan, great, thank you. And you did reference the exhibit that the Northern Virginia Urban League opened in 2008. And it was a wonderful exhibit, and it forms the basis for our new exhibit on the domestic slave trade. And when they opened that exhibit in 2008, it was the Urban League's gift to the city of Alexandria. And many of you on the Zoom probably visited that exhibit in the basement. One of the great things about what we are trying to do with Freedom House is be totally inclusive, not only in transparent in our history, our language, and accessibility. So there was another question in the chat about an elevator. We do have an elevator in the building that goes to the top 3 floors, but does not go to the basement. So that is why we have moved the exhibition from the basement to the first floor so that we make sure it is accessible to our audience. Another question that we had was from a gentleman who wanted to know, during the Civil War, was the military prison used for Union soldiers punished for legal transgressions or Confederate POWs or others? And I will turn that over to SmithGroup or to Ben Skolnick, who's also on our Zoom as well.
I will start that very quickly, and maybe Daria can chime in as well. I think predominantly it was used for Union soldiers. There may have been some Confederates housed there, but Daria or Ben, do you have?
That's correct. It's primarily Union soldiers who are held for a variety of relatively small infractions. You know, your usual drunk, disorderly, out without a pass, their passes weren't signed, just general disciplinary infractions. But there are also a few documented Confederate POWs. There's an account from one of Mosby's raiders who's held here for a little bit, but also unruly Alexandrians, civilians who were arrested by the provost marshal, the military governor is not the right word, but the military authority in town under martial law. So it's a mix, but it's mostly Union military. It's Union military prison.
Thanks, Ben. And Ben, I am going to throw another question to you because it's one that we commonly get. And was Freedom House the site where Solomon Northup from 12 Years a Slave was held? And would you like to address that?
It's not, but it is a question we get a lot, and it's an answer that all the way back to the Civil War and before, people have been confusing, and the confusion comes from the birch. And so the birch of the Solomon Northup story is a man named James H. Birch, and the birch from Price Birch and Company, whose name's on the building in the Civil War photographs, is William H. Birch. And so I don't know what the relation is, but I have to assume that they're brothers or uncles or nephews, cousins. I have to assume there's some kind of relation, the two slave traders. And so Solomon Northup was held in James H. Birch's jail up in DC. And the conflation of these two sites, it happens, and you see it even during its Civil War letters back and forth, that people come to Alexandria and say they've seen the site of James Birch's jail where Solomon Northup was held. And so when you look into it, we're almost certain that it's not this site.
Thanks, Ben. And we also had another follow-up question to the basement exhibition, and I think I can answer this one. And it is, will the basement exhibition be maintained? We are definitely maintaining the record of that exhibition in its entirety, but we have used it as a jumping off point to expand the story of the domestic slave trade. And one of the things that's very important to us at Freedom House is bringing in the voice of those who were enslaved and trafficked through the building. So we are using historical accounts when we can to fully flesh out their story and to give them the agency that they did not have when they were held in the building. Some other questions that have come in, and this one I think for SmithGroup, what could you tell us about the door that you mentioned finding?
Yes.
People are intrigued about that.
Yes, so through the old permit documents that we obtained, we have some rough floor plans of when the building was converted to apartments and a boarding house. And so in looking at those images, I noticed that in addition to that, and from the 1985 renovation drawings, there was reference to infilling a door. And so I went back to the old permit drawings from that period of being a boarding house and realized that, yes, there was in fact a door that connected, I think it was a bathroom, to one of the bedrooms in this, it was an interesting configuration of apartments and residential in this building. But knowing that, we cut a hole in the drywall, and sure enough, the door frame is still there. One side of it is concealed. It's actually on the inside of a mechanical closet. And so you don't see it from that side, and you don't see it from the hallway because it's been finished in drywall. But once we cut away the drywall, you could clearly see the original door frame. It's pretty narrow, only about 24 inches wide, maybe a little bit less. But we believe that it would have been a door from period 4. So sometime in the middle to late 19th century, during the time as an apartment building. So it's still there, and we can still, and there may be one on a second level too. We found one on one level, and I think that there may be one on another level of the building. So
thanks, Susan. That's great to know. Thank you.
We patched the drywall back up and kept going, but it's there.
No, that's really great to know. Another question for the team about whoever would like to answer this from SmithGroup. What were any surprises that you found? What were during the research and during your time in the building that you'd like to share with our audience?
Susan, I'll let you start that one. You have all the surprises.
The surprises. Oh, it was interesting to find, as I mentioned, those masonry infills within the basement that we believe connected out to the men's and women's yard. There's a lot of speculation about the connection to the men's yard. Was it a below grade holding cell? It's sort of undetermined at this point. You know, there's some interesting architectural detailing at the third floor. They've stripped the plaster off of one of the walls at the third floor, and there's a very large window that looks out towards the north. There's some interesting detailing in the brick arch and details above that window that I think have another story to tell, and I think we need to do some more investigations there. Yeah, there are a lot of little surprises here and there. As we were on the second floor, you know, cutting back some of the drywall and looking at some of the remaining plaster, you could tell that there were multiple plaster campaigns that had been done, particularly on one of the fireplaces. You could see 2 layers of a 3-coat plaster, and between 2 of the layers, there was evidence of where one of the walls from that period of when it was an apartment had intersected. And so it's starting to confirm some of these details that we see in some of these archival documents. There is one mystery masonry opening. As you stand in the west alley today and you look up at the second floor, there's a very distinct masonry infill that when measured is about 7 feet tall. One would think this is possibly a door, but we can't quite figure out yet, would that have connected with to some construction within the men's yard? That remains a mystery, and that was one of the elements that we identified for further research. We tried to find evidence of that on the inside face of the wall. It was difficult to find. So I think that is one of the mysteries that remains, is exactly what that masonry opening was for, what story that might tell us. And as you review the entire exterior facade, there are various elements where you see old framing members framed into the facade that may be direct evidence of how some of these men's and women's yards, how roof coverings would have been framed into the side of the building. I could keep going. There's one last thing I will mention as well, is that as you stand in the east facade and you look at the outside of both of the chimneys, there's sort of a shadow and ghosting of fireplaces at all 3 elevations. If you go to the historic structure report and look at the 3D renderings, we have depicted those on all 3 levels. So a lot of question as to why that was there. I speculate that it was part of the original construction of when it was a residence, and possibly the future planning for an additional house directly adjacent. This would have been the party wall between 2 residences, and maybe there would have been a double fireplace. Double fireplaces on either side sharing a similar flue. So that's an interesting detail that leaves you scratching your head. Why were there fireplaces on the outside of this building on all 3 levels?
That is really interesting. Thank you,
Yes.
Susan, for a wealth of information. And Dayton, I see you're on camera with us, and I know you've done a lot of work with SmithGroup, especially in Richmond. And what do you think the commonalities are between us here with Freedom House and what's going on in Shockoe Bottom in Richmond with the Lumpkin Slave Jail and Devil's Half Acre there? Are you seeing any commonalities in the work that's being done and the work that SmithGroup has done in Richmond?
This is an entirely different animal in the sense that, the Lumpkin Slave Jail is, well, for one, was believed to be entirely consumed in the construction of I-95. And, recent archaeological exploratory digs as recent as 2008 and 2009 have revealed that, in fact, portions of the original, what we call the slave jail, and a tavern, which were part of the original compound, which consisted of Robert Lumpkin's private residence and hotel, are in fact buried underneath a asphalt parking lot. And I think, for us, the physicality of what remains is very different than what you have here. Obviously the slave pens themselves are no longer here on your site, but at least there is some at least the main building, is still here. And that presents a lot of, opportunities and more of a clear, tangible artifact that you have to deal with. Whereas I think for us, there's a lot of questions around how to interpret artifacts that have been in a sense removed or no longer present. At best, once we uncover the archaeology, we may have foundations. And so I know that's not a common thing, that's kind of a different thing. But it is kind of profound that you actually have a physical, tangible relic and vestige of history that you can actually use as part of your interpretation, which I think is fascinating. What else?
Dayton, do you know of any other slave pens, jails being used as museums from your work or that you've come across?
I don't, not original. That's what I think. That's what makes Lumpkins so profound, and unique and special, in that it.
I was going to chime in with the old slave mart in Charleston is the one
right.
to mind.
Right.
And then we have 1707 Duke Street Bruins Jail. It's not as a museum, but it's offices just down the street from here.
Right, still exists.
Yeah, the rest have all been lost to a lot of them to 20th century development, urban renewal, fires. They all happen to be in the places that cities have grown since 1865. And a slave jail isn't a piece of architecture that has much of a use beyond the Civil War.
Right, absolutely. And unfortunately, Dayton, speaking to what you had mentioned earlier, we in Alexandria are used to uncovering history that's been buried by parking lots and under asphalt when you think about our Freedman Cemetery site. And Ben, just while you were on the back with us on the Zoom, another question that we've had, and I think this might be a question best directed to you, any evidence of burial grounds on the site?
There is no evidence of burials on the site. It's something I think I'm aware of. There's a recorded incident of a cholera outbreak on the other end of the domestic slave trade, Franklin and Armfield. Several enslaved people died from cholera down in Natchez. And what they ended up doing was going out into a ravine and burying them in a very shallow grave that was later found by the city of Natchez. And they almost ran them out of town for it.
I remember that. Yeah.
And Josh Rothman talks about it in his book. I think it's how he opens his book. And
yes.
So, if we don't have any documented instances of enslaved people dying of disease at 1315 Duke Street, but I can't imagine it didn't happen. The first place I would go looking is down at Penny Hill, the city's municipal burying ground. And that's if they didn't find a ravine somewhere and dig a shallow grave here in Alexandria. So not on site, and I think on site might be not the first place I would look, but it is something I'm aware of.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. And yes, it does start on Dr. Joshua Rothman's book, The Ledger and the Chain, that deals with a lot of the history of Franklin and Armfield. And it's a very, very powerful part of that book. And for our last question, directed to SmithGroup, what percentage of original fabric do you estimate from the period of significance?
Good question. I think what was clear in a lot of what we presented today is we had to really search for some original fabric that is to the period of significance. Obviously, the building enclosure, there are elements of that date to the period, but on the inside, a lot of our investigations, probes, and analysis were seeking out that material and fabric from the period of significance. So, Susan, maybe you want to weigh in on that as well.
Yeah. I think that at this point, it's limited to the masonry structure, the exterior enclosure of the building, some of the wood framing, structural components of the structure, but I think that unfortunately, many of the interior finishes have been lost. As we could tell through the finish analysis, is that the windows either were added at a later time period, or the actual double hung wood windows that you see today, they are not original. There have been many modifications through the years. But I can say with a certain amount of confidence that the exterior envelope and the masonry elements of the main block, the south block of the residence, there were some interesting studies that we did overlaying, and you saw in the images where there's photographic analysis. There's several images included in an appendix to the HSR where we did that similar sort of overlay. It really brought forward a lot of questions that we have about the west elevation, particularly the area of the central passage. And I do believe that portions of that central passage, that west elevation, do date to the slave pen period. And you can pretty quickly find where that original iron gate would have been located. And then, of course, you have the north block structure that we're confident that a lot of the masonry is original. But like I said, some of those architectural features and trim work have been lost. The north block of the building in the 1980s, the floor framing structure was replaced. So I think that the original floor framing that we do have is what remains in the south block in the main, I call it the resident portion, but the main front part of the building that was originated as a residence.
Thank you, Susan.
Mm-hmm.
We've had some fantastic questions. I want to thank SmithGroup for their presentation. I encourage everyone who's on our Zoom to download the full historic structures report, which is indeed impressive. And we want to, again, thank SmithGroup for the wonderful work that you've done on the site. Thank Dr. Benjamin Skolnick for his in-depth research on our Freedom House site. And just to say thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you in 2022, and be on the lookout for updates from us about Freedom House and the future of Freedom House. And we wish you all good health and safety. Thank you.